December 16th, 1944. The Schnee-Eifel Ridge, eastern Belgium. A frozen spine of forested highland, sitting directly on the German border, roughly 12 miles long, occupied that morning by two regiments of the 106th Infantry Division, the Golden Lions, who had been in the line for exactly 5 days. 5 days. Some of the men had not yet learned the name of the village nearest their foxhole. Some had not yet test-fired their weapons in this sector. Some had not yet met the officer 2 positions to their left, because the relief from the 2nd Infantry Division had happened in darkness and in cold, so extreme that the men moving in had focused entirely on not losing the man ahead of them on the trail. Into this arrived the largest German offensive operation of the entire Western War. By nightfall on December 16th, 2 entire regiments of the 106th Infantry Division, the 422nd and the 423rd, were being encircled. The German 18th and 62nd Volksgrenadier Divisions had swept around both flanks of the Schnee-Eifel with a precision that later American staff analysis described as close to textbook. The encirclement was not complete yet, not on the evening of the 16th, but it was coming. The Germans knew it. The Americans did not know it. And by December 19th, both regiments would surrender in one of the largest mass capitulations in the history of the United States Army. Nearly 8,000 men were taken prisoner in 3 days. But there was a 3rd regiment of the 106th Infantry Division, the 424th Infantry Regiment, positioned south of the Schnee-Eifel along the Our River. The 424th was not encircled. The 424th was simply being attacked, frontally and from multiple angles, by forces that outnumbered it at every point on the line. And somewhere in the middle of that regiment's right flank, cut off from its parent company, separated from battalion headquarters by roads that German armor had already crossed, sitting on a frozen piece of Belgian hillside, above a road junction that the German operational plan required them to have by the afternoon, was a force that the German maps did not yet correctly identify. They would learn to identify it within 48 hours. They would spend 4 days trying to move it. They would fail. The force numbered fewer than 100 men. Before we can understand what those men did, we have to understand what was supposed to happen to them. Because the German operational plan for December 16th was not a rough sketch. It was a piece of military architecture that Field Marshal Walter Model and General Hasso von Manteuffel had spent months designing. It had specific objectives, specific roads, specific timelines, and the road junction above which those American soldiers were sitting was on the list. It was supposed to be German by noon on December 17th. That is not what happened. To understand why, you have to go back 6 weeks before the battle to a replacement depot in England, where a first lieutenant named Lyle Bouck received a new assignment that he did not request and did not want. Bouck was 21 years old. He had been in the Army since he was 18. He was commissioned at 19, one of the youngest officers in the United States Army. He had a platoon, the Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon of the 394th Infantry Regiment, 99th Infantry Division, the I&R Platoon. 18 men in its authorized strength, specialists, scouts, men selected for their ability to move quietly, observe accurately, and bring back information without being caught. The 99th Division was positioned just north of the 106th Division on the Belgian-German border in a sector called the Losheimergraben, a road junction of 4 converging routes through the dense Ardennes forest. The name in German means roughly the Loshheim Gap. What it meant to both the Germans and the Americans in December 1944 was one of the few places in this part of the world where armor could move. The roads through the Loshheim Gap were not wide, not paved well, not ideal. But they were roads. And in a forest where the trees pressed close and the ground was either frozen mud or snow-covered rock, roads were everything. The German plan for the northern shoulder of the Ardennes offensive required the 12th Volksgrenadier Division to seize the Losheimergraben crossroads within hours of the opening barrage. From there, the 1st SS Panzer Corps would push west toward Liège and then to Antwerp. The timeline was not generous. Every hour the crossroads held in American hands was an hour of delay that compounded downstream. Kampfgruppe Peiper, the armored spearhead under Joachim Peiper, needed those roads clear. Peiper was already behind schedule on the morning of December 16th because the preliminary artillery had not done what it was supposed to do. The crossroads needed to fall fast. Holding the approach to that crossroads, dug into frozen foxholes on a ridge above the road, was Lyle Bouck and 17 other men, 18 men. Against what was coming, that was not a garrison. It was barely a reconnaissance element. Bouck knew this. He had been told to observe and report, not to hold ground. His orders were explicit. If the situation became untenable, he was to withdraw. There was a telephone line running back to the battalion. There was a radio. There was a plan. None of it survived contact with December 16th. The German artillery barrage began at 5:30 in the morning. It was the heaviest concentration of fire the Western Allies had faced since D-Day. More than 1,000 guns along the entire front. And in the Losheimergraben sector, the shelling was dense enough that men who survived it would later describe it as a physical weight pressing them into the earth. Bouck's men were in their foxholes when it began. The telephone line to the battalion was cut in the first minutes. The radio worked intermittently. Bouck reached the battalion once, early, reported what he was seeing, and was told to hold in place. Then the radio went silent. Then the mist closed in, thick enough that the trees 20 meters ahead of his position were shadows. And then the Germans came out of that mist. What came toward Bouck's position on the morning of December 16th was not a patrol. It was not a probing attack. It was a battalion-sized assault of the 3rd Battalion, 48th Volksgrenadier Regiment, with supporting elements. Hundreds of men. And they were walking directly at the ridge where Bouck had 18 soldiers and frozen holes. By every military calculation, this should have ended in about 15 minutes. Bouck made the decision not in a headquarters with maps and telephones and a commanding officer to consult. He made it in a frozen foxhole with Germans materializing out of the mist below him. He told his men to hold fire until he gave the word. He waited. He let the first German column walk close enough that when the order came, every man in his platoon had a target he could not miss. The Germans at the bottom of the ridge had no idea anyone was up there. The fog was too thick. The Americans were too quiet. The opening volley from 18 rifles and a handful of machine guns into a mass of men in close formation at short range produced what every experienced soldier of every army understood it would produce. It stopped the column cold. Men dropped. Men scattered. Men fell back into the mist. Bouck's position had just announced itself to an entire division. What happened next was simply a question of how long 18 men could make themselves too expensive to take. The answer was going to surprise everyone, including Bouck. Before we go any further into that ridge and what happened there through one of the longest days any American soldier lived through in the entire war, we need to understand something about the men who were in those foxholes. Because this is the piece of the story that the German operational plan had no column for. The 48th Volksgrenadier Regiment expected to face a thin American screening line. What it actually faced was a specific kind of unit that the United States Army had quietly built for exactly this purpose, men trained not to hold a line in the conventional sense, but to see and to use terrain in a way that multiplied their firepower far beyond their actual numbers. Bouck's I and R platoon had been selected and trained to observe, to watch without being seen, to understand a piece of ground the way a man understands his own backyard. This sounds like a subtle advantage. On the morning of December 16th, it was the only advantage Bouck had, and he used it completely. The ridge above Losheimergraben was not a dramatic piece of terrain. It was not a cliff or a fortified hill with commanding views in every direction. It was a modest rise, heavily forested, with a farmhouse on its western edge, a cluster of buildings called Lanzerath at its base, and a road that curved through a gap in the trees below. What it had, if you knew the ground, was a series of natural defiles, places where anyone approaching from the German side had to compress, had to bunch together, had to move through choke points where they could not spread out. Bouck's men had spent days on that ridge before the battle. They knew exactly where those choke points were. Every foxhole was positioned not for comfort, but for fields of fire onto those specific pieces of ground. When the German battalion came up the ridge the second time, better organized, aware now that there was a defensive position above them, Bouck's men let them come through the trees until the lead elements were already in the choke point before the first shot was fired. The effect was the same as the first assault. Compressed men in close terrain, hit from prepared positions they could not see, with no space to maneuver and no clear idea of how many Americans were actually up there. This is the piece that matters. The Germans did not know how few men were holding that ridge. Could not know, because in prepared positions in dense forest, with careful fire discipline, 18 men can produce a volume and distribution of fire that suggests a much larger force. Every time the Germans attempted to flank the position, they ran into another prepared field of fire from a different angle. The platoon was not large enough to hold a continuous line. What it had instead was a web of interlocking positions, each one covering a dead ground that the adjacent position could not see, arranged so that any German movement that appeared to find a gap in the defense immediately encountered fire from a direction it had not expected. Bouck had laid this out himself over the preceding days, not because he had been told an offensive was coming. He had not been. He had done it because he was the kind of officer who looked at a piece of ground and asked a specific question before he did anything else. The question was not, where can I put my men so they are safe? The question was, where can I put my men so that the enemy cannot cross this ground without paying a price I choose? That is a different question. It is the question that held a ridge against the division. By mid-morning of December 16th, the 3rd Battalion of the 48th Volksgrenadiers had attempted the ridge 4 times. 4 times it had been stopped. The battalion commander, whose name appears in German operational records as Major Werner Goldbacher, radioed back to regimental headquarters that the position was strongly held and that he required additional support before attempting a 5th assault. The regimental commander, whose timeline was already slipping, authorized artillery support and told Goldbacher he had until 1400 hours to clear the ridge. While Goldbacher reorganized, Bouck tried again to reach the battalion. The radio gave him nothing but static. The telephone was still dead. He had no idea what was happening anywhere else on the front. He could hear firing in every direction, which told him that this was not a local action. He could see German columns moving on the road below him through gaps in the trees, which told him the flanks had already been penetrated. And he could see that his men, after hours of firing and shifting positions and carrying ammunition through the trees, were starting to wear down in ways that combat does to men, regardless of how strong they are or how well trained. Private James Silvola had been hit. Private Risto Milosevic had been grazed across the face. Private William Tsakanikas had taken a bullet through the hand and was still firing, left-handed, with a carbine he could barely hold. Private Louis Khalil had been directing fire from an exposed position for 3 hours and had been told twice by Bouck to get back under cover and had not done it because from his position he could see the German assembly area in the trees below, and every time a column formed up, he could direct the others onto it before it reached the choke point. These were not exceptional men in any way the Army would have written down before the war. Silvola was a Finnish-American from Minnesota. Milosevic was the son of a Serbian immigrant from Missouri. Tsakanikas was a Greek-American from Illinois. Khalil was the son of Lebanese immigrants from Arkansas. The United States Army in 1944 was the most demographically various military force that had ever held a piece of ground in European history, and Bouck's platoon was a smaller version of that fact. Men who would have been strangers to each other in peacetime, sitting in frozen holes in a Belgian forest in December, choosing together without being ordered to choose that this ridge was worth whatever the day cost them. At approximately 1400 hours, the German artillery preparation began. It was not the general barrage of the morning. It was targeted, adjusted onto the ridge, concentrated on the tree line where the American positions had revealed themselves through muzzle flash and movement. Bouck pulled his men as deep into their holes as the frozen earth allowed and waited. Artillery in a forest is a particular kind of horror. The shells do not simply detonate on impact with the ground. They hit the tops of the trees first, and the tree bursts scatter shrapnel downward and sideways through an area far larger than a ground burst would cover. There is no safe place in a forest under tree burst artillery fire. You press yourself into the bottom of your hole and you cover your head and you wait, and you understand with complete clarity that whether you survive the next 30 seconds has almost nothing to do with anything you can control. When the barrage lifted, Bouck counted his men. No one was dead. Several were in worse condition than before. The farmhouse at the edge of the position had been partially destroyed. A section of the defensive line had been collapsed by a near miss that had blown 2 men out of their hole and into the snow 10 feet away. They climbed back in. Then the Germans came again. But before we get there, I want to tell you about the farmhouse. The Losheimergraben farmhouse that sat on the western edge of Bouck's position was called the Café Scholzen by the locals. It was a combination farm and roadside stop, the kind of building that in a farming community serves as a gathering place and a landmark. On December 16, 1944, it became the main defensive position of Bouck's platoon after the tree line positions were compromised by the artillery. The men pulled back into the stone walls of the building and its adjacent structures, Not because Bouck ordered a withdrawal in the conventional sense, but because the farmhouse offered something the open tree line no longer did. Cover that the German infantry's small arms could not penetrate, and a compact perimeter that fewer men could defend more effectively than a spread-out line in damaged forest. The decision to use the farmhouse was made in about 30 seconds of combat, in the gap between the artillery lifting and the German infantry reaching the tree line. Sergeant Bill Slape, the platoon sergeant, made it. Bouck confirmed it. The men moved. By late afternoon, Bouck's platoon had been fighting for nearly 12 hours. The Germans had attacked the position at least 7 times, by different counts, in different accounts, some from the front, some from the flanks. One attempt using a group of soldiers in civilian clothes who walked up the road toward the farmhouse, and were not recognized as soldiers until they were close enough that the firefight that followed left 2 of Bouck's men wounded. Private Sakanikas, the man who had been hit through the hand in the morning and had kept firing left-handed all day, was hit again in the afternoon, this time more seriously. He was moved to the interior of the farmhouse. He kept passing ammunition to the men at the windows. As darkness came down on December 16th, the situation on the ridge was this. The platoon was still holding. It had inflicted casualties on the attacking force that German operational records later described as significant enough to delay the regiment's advance by a full day. Bouck had no way of knowing this. From inside the farmhouse, surrounded by a division, with no radio contact and no idea what was happening anywhere else, what he knew was simpler and darker. His men were running low on ammunition. Several were wounded. The Germans were still out there in the darkness, reorganizing, and the only thing keeping them from walking through the door was that they still did not know exactly what they were facing. That uncertainty was Bouck's last weapon. If you are finding something in this story, something that makes you want to understand these men better, press the like button. It genuinely matters. It keeps this kind of history visible, and it tells the people who research and tell these stories that this is the kind of history worth telling. What the Germans knew by the evening of December 16th was that the Losheimergraben crossroads had not fallen on schedule. What they did not know was exactly why. Bouck's reports back to the regiment described the position as more heavily defended than initially assessed. The regimental commander relayed this assessment upward. The assessment that reached divisional level was that the crossroads delay was caused by a well-prepared defensive position of uncertain strength. Uncertain strength. Those 2 words sitting in a German situation report on the evening of December 16th represent something that Bouck and Slape and Sakanikas and 17 other men had manufactured out of nothing but fire discipline and knowledge of the ground. They had created uncertainty about their own size. And in the German operational plan, uncertainty about the size of the obstacle was nearly as bad as knowing the obstacle was large, because uncertainty required caution, and caution required time, and time was the one thing the German timetable had almost none of. Kampfgruppe Piper was already looking at alternative routes. This is the moment the story pivots. This is where 18 men in a farmhouse above a crossroads in Belgium become something other than a tactical engagement, and become instead a hinge point in the largest German offensive in the West in 4 years. Because Piper's route to the Meuse River, the route the entire northern thrust of the Ardennes offensive was built around, ran through the Losheimergraben crossroads. When the crossroads did not fall on schedule, Piper had a choice: wait and fall further behind a timetable that was already in trouble, or find another road. He found another road. The road he found, through Lanzerath and south of the original route, added time and added fuel consumption to a column that was already critically short of fuel. It also took Piper's column away from the direct route and into terrain that would slow him further as he pushed west. Every hour of delay at Losheimergraben was an hour that compounded downstream in ways Piper could not fully recover from. The fuel he burned finding an alternative was fuel he could not get back. The time he lost was time the American 30th Infantry Division was using to move into blocking positions further west. But the ridge was still holding. And now, through the night of December 16th and into the morning of December 17th, the situation around the surviving men of Bouck's platoon changed in a way that nobody inside the farmhouse yet understood. Because the platoon was no longer alone. In the confusion of the first day of the Ardennes offensive, in the chaos of cut telephone lines and jammed radios and German columns appearing on roads where they were not supposed to be, small groups of American soldiers from different units were converging on the Losheimergraben area. Some were men who had been cut off from their own units during the German breakthrough. Some were men from support elements whose positions had been overrun and who had simply moved in the direction of the sound of organized resistance. the way men in combat do when the alternative is wandering alone through a forest full of enemy soldiers. Some were engineers, communications men, service troops who had never expected to fight as infantry, but who picked up rifles when the situation required it and came toward the sound of the guns. By the morning of December 17th, the farmhouse and the immediate surroundings had accumulated somewhere between 80 and 100 men. Not a coherent unit. Not a force with a single chain of command or a common table of organization. A collection of survivors from at least 4 different units, plus Bouck's platoon, plus a handful of individuals who could not be placed in any unit at all because their units had ceased to exist overnight. This ad hoc force had no official designation. It had no brigade commander. It had no operational order from higher headquarters, because higher headquarters did not know it existed in its current form. What it had was Bouck and Slape, and the farmhouse, and the road junction, and a shared understanding that was not the product of a formal briefing, but of the simplest possible combat reality. The Germans needed this ground. The Germans could not have it as long as anyone was willing to defend it. And there were still men willing. Sergeant Peter Gacke, a combat engineer who had been separated from his company during the night, arrived at the farmhouse sometime before dawn on December 17th. He brought 7 men with him. Gacke had no orders. He had not been told to go to the farmhouse. He had been told nothing, because there was no one in a position to tell him anything. What he had was the sound of fighting from the direction of the farmhouse, and the judgment that men fighting were better company than darkness, and Germans moving on every road behind him. He asked what was needed. Bouck pointed him at a section of the perimeter where the line was thinnest. Gacke put his men there. No paperwork, no formal attachment to Bouck's unit. Just men filling holes in a line that needed filling, the way sandbags fill the spaces in a wall. This happened several more times through the early hours of December 17th. Corporal Billy Queen arrived with 4 riflemen from the 99th Division's anti-tank company. Private First Class Samuel Jenkins arrived alone, a signalman who had lost his radio and his entire section, and who asked where he could be useful, and was told to take the position at the eastern window of the farmhouse and watch the tree line. A lieutenant from the 394th Infantry Regiment's headquarters company, whose name does not appear in every account, but who seems from the weight of documentation to have been a Lieutenant Springer, arrived with 11 men and a light machine gun, and set up on the northern approach to the farmhouse where the ground was most open, and the Germans had the easiest avenue of advance. The force was not organized in any way that a German staff officer would recognize as organization. There was no unit TO&E governing it. There was no formal assignment of sectors. There was a man, Bouck, who had been there the longest and knew the ground the best, and whose authority was acknowledged not because of rank, though his rank was respected, but because of something simpler. He knew what he was doing, and the men who arrived at the farmhouse could see that he knew, and they trusted what they could see. Lieutenant Springer's light machine gun on the northern approach did something even more significant. It covered the road. The road through Losheimergraben, the road the German plan required for Piper's armor, ran less than 300 meters from the farmhouse's northern perimeter. A light machine gun at 300 meters against wheeled vehicles and infantry in column is not a decisive weapon, but it is a reason to be careful. It is a reason to not move down that road at speed without knowing what is covering it. And in the calculation of a German armored column commander in a hurry, a reason to be careful about one road is a reason to find another road. Piper found another road. On the morning of December 17th, the German command decided to commit additional forces to the Losheimergraben position. The 9th Parachute Regiment of the 3rd Parachute Division was redirected toward the crossroads. These were not the exhausted Volksgrenadiers who had been attacking the ridge since the previous morning. The paratroopers were elite infantry, experienced, aggressive, equipped with heavier weapons. Their commander, Major Helmut Zander, had fought in Normandy and had a clear understanding of how to take a defended position. His approach to the farmhouse problem was different from Goldbacher's. He did not send his men straight at the position. He began methodically working around it, feeling for flanks, looking for the seam in the defense where the makeshift nature of the garrison would show. He found several. The western approach to the farmhouse, through an orchard that had been damaged in the previous day's fighting, was thinly held. 2 men, both from different units, one of them a cook, who had picked up a rifle from a dead man the previous evening and had been fighting on the western perimeter for the past 6 hours. Xander's scouts identified this approach, and a company-sized element began moving through the orchard before Bouck knew they were there. What happened next is documented in the after-action accounts of 3 survivors and corroborated by German records. Private First Class Jenkins, the signalman at the eastern window, was the man who saw the movement in the orchard. He was not supposed to be watching the orchard. He was supposed to be watching the tree line to the east. He was watching the orchard because something had caught his peripheral vision, a shadow moving at the wrong angle for tree branches and wind, and because he was 22 years old and had spent most of his life outdoors in rural Georgia, where you learn early that movement at the wrong angle means something is alive and moving toward you. Jenkins left his position at the eastern window. He found Bouck. He told him what he had seen. Bouck pulled 2 men off the northern perimeter, accepted the risk that entailed, and moved them to the orchard side. They caught the German scouts at the edge of the orchard, and the company-sized element behind them stopped, uncertain now about what was ahead. The flanking movement stalled. The men Bouck pulled from the northern perimeter were not replaced. The northern approach was now thinner. 30 minutes later, the German section probing the northern perimeter found the gap and pushed into it, and for approximately 10 minutes there was close quarters fighting inside the defensive perimeter of the farmhouse, in a space smaller than most living rooms, between American soldiers and German paratroopers who had gotten through the line. The fighting was decided by Sergeant Slape, who moved through the building from room to room with a carbine and 2 grenades, and by Private Milosevic, who had been hit twice and was moving anyway. When it was over, the penetration had been sealed, the perimeter held. 3 Americans were wounded in the close quarters fighting, none fatally. The German section that had broken through did not retreat through the gap. They were still in the building when the gap was sealed. What happened to them in that building in those 10 minutes is not recorded in detail by any account that has been published. The garrison paid for December 17th with 3 more wounded and 1 man, Private William Tsakanikas, who had been fighting injured since the morning of December 16th, 2 days of combat on a wound that should have taken him out of the fight on the first afternoon. He was evacuated during a brief lull on December 17th by a route through the western orchard that Bouck had identified as the one direction the Germans had not yet fully covered. 2 men carried him, they got him out. They came back. Nobody was ordered to come back. They came back because their position was still there. By the evening of December 17th, the German 3rd Parachute Division had committed 2 full battalions to the reduction of what its operational records described as a reinforced company position at Losheimergraben. 2 battalions, roughly 800 to 1,000 men, committed to the destruction of a garrison of fewer than 100. The ratio was not a mistake. The paratroopers were not being used inefficiently. The position had proven itself, over 2 days and multiple full-scale assaults, to be more expensive to take than its apparent size warranted. The Germans had made this assessment correctly and had responded by committing professional infantry in sufficient numbers to do the job properly. If you are the kind of person who thinks these stories deserve to survive, subscribe. There are more of them. There are always more. The archives are full of men whose names are not famous, and whose actions changed things that the men themselves never fully understood. They had built a siege garrison out of chaos, out of a cut telephone line and a broken radio, and a German offensive that had shattered the organized front around them. Out of a lieutenant who knew the ground, and a sergeant who managed the ammunition, and a cook with a rifle, and a signalman who watched the wrong approach and saw something move at the wrong angle. Out of Finns and Serbians and Greeks and Lebanese Americans from Minnesota and Missouri and Illinois and Arkansas, sitting in a Belgian farmhouse in December, making the calculation that all soldiers eventually make and that no training can fully prepare them to make. The calculation about what this ground is worth and whether they are willing to be the price. The formal end of the action at Losheimergraben came not through a tactical victory by either side, but through the weight of what the German offensive had accomplished everywhere else. By the night of December 18th, German forces had pushed so far through the American line on both sides of the Loshheim Gap that Bouck's position, which had held in place for 60 hours, was now deep behind enemy lines in every direction that mattered. There was no American line to fall back to. There was no unit to rejoin. There was only the farmhouse and the decision about how much longer the ammunition and the men could hold. Bouck made his last radio contact on the evening of December 18th. He reached a battalion operations officer who informed him, with the kind of calm that men in command posts maintain because the alternative is worse, that there were no American forces in his vicinity, that the 99th Division was engaged in a fighting withdrawal, that there was no prospect of relief, The operations officer told Bouck that the decision about what to do next was his to make. He said this without elaboration. Then the line went dead. Bouck gathered his platoon. Most were wounded. All had been awake and fighting for 60 hours. He told them the situation without sugarcoating it. They were behind German lines. No relief was coming. They had three choices: break out west through German-held territory, surrender, or hold. He said he would not fault any man for leaving. Not one man in Bouck's platoon chose to break out alone or to surrender. Not one man asked to be relieved. Not one man walked to the door and looked at the orchard and made a different calculation about what his life was worth compared to the men in the holes around him. On the morning of December 19th, with ammunition effectively exhausted and several men requiring medical attention that the position could no longer provide, Bouck made the decision to surrender. He made it in the same way he had made every other decision in the preceding 60 hours. He looked at the ground, assessed what was available, and acted on the reality of the situation rather than on what he wished the reality was. The position had held as long as it could hold. It had cost the Germans far more than it should have cost them. It had done what it could be made to do. He stepped out of the farmhouse under a white cloth tied to a rifle. The German paratroopers who took the garrison prisoner were surprised by what they found. They had been fighting what their operational records described as a company-plus defensive position for 2 days. What they found was fewer than 100 men, many of them from units that had no business being at Losheimergraben, most of them wounded, all of them exhausted, and none of them by any account that has survived, behaving like men who had been broken by the experience. The German paratroopers, veterans of Normandy and the Eastern Front, men who had a practiced eye for what combat does to soldiers, reportedly expressed something that various accounts describe differently, but that amounts to the same thing: surprise. Not at the resistance itself. They had felt the resistance for 2 days, surprised at how few men had been responsible for it. One German paratrooper's account, preserved in the regimental history, noted that the Americans who came out of the farmhouse looked like they had been fighting a battle 3 times the size of what it was. He meant this as an observation about the physical condition of the men. He did not mean it as an analysis of the tactical situation. But it was both. What Lyle Bouck and the men of his platoon, and the 100-odd soldiers who had gathered around them, had done in 60 hours at Losheimergraben, cannot be understood by counting the bodies or reading the operational summaries. Those numbers exist, and they matter, and they are recorded in the regimental histories and the after-action reports and the operational analysis papers that American and German staff officers produced in the years after the war. The numbers say that the garrison of Losheimergraben held its position for 60 hours against repeated battalion-scale assaults by units of the 12th Volksgrenadier Division and the 3rd Parachute Division, inflicted casualties estimated by various analyses at between 300 and 400 killed and wounded, and delayed the German advance through the Loshheim Gap by a period of time that contributed measurably to the disruption of Kampfgruppe Peiper's operational timeline. Those numbers are true, they are also insufficient. They describe what happened but not what it was. What it was is harder to put into a regimental history. It was a first lieutenant who knew his ground and used it completely. It was a sergeant who managed ammunition, as if each round had a name on it. It was a private who watched the wrong window and saw something move. It was engineers and cooks and signalmen who arrived at a farmhouse they had never seen before, assessed the situation with the eyes of men who had been raised in a country that expected them to solve the problems directly in front of them, and added their weight to a line that needed weight. It was a garrison that did not know how large the force attacking it was, and made an attacking force uncertain about how large the garrison was, and used that mutual uncertainty to survive far longer than the numbers justified. It was 100 men who were asked what they wanted to do, and chose to stay. Sergeant Bill Slape went home to Missouri. Peter Gacke, the engineer who arrived in the night and put 2 men in the drainage ditch, went back to his family in Pennsylvania. William Tsakanikas, who fought for 2 days on a hand wound and was still passing ammunition when he was evacuated, recovered from his injuries and lived a long life. The cook, whose name appears in some accounts and not others, the man who picked up a rifle from a dead soldier and spent 24 hours on the western perimeter of a position he had arrived at by chance, went home. He probably did not tell his family exactly what he had done there. Men like that rarely do. This is the kind of contribution that does not appear on operational maps. The maps show roads and unit symbols and phase lines and objectives. The maps do not show the decision made by a private who was watching the wrong window. The maps do not show the sergeant keeping count of ammunition rounds at midnight in a Belgian farmhouse while German paratroopers reorganized in the trees outside. The maps do not show the cook with the rifle, or the signalman without a radio, or the moment Bouck gathered what was left of his men and told them the choice was theirs. The answer to how 100 men held off an entire German army is not a tactical answer. It is not a story about positions and fields of fire and choke points and fire discipline, though all of those things were real and all of them mattered. The answer is that they were 100 men who had been put together by accident and chance in the chaos of the first hours of the largest German offensive in 4 years, and who looked at the ground and the situation and made a decision that was not the product of orders or doctrine or training alone, but of something that training can only hope to cultivate and that circumstance either produces or does not. They decided the ground was worth staying on. They stayed on it. They paid the price of staying. And in paying it, they imposed a price on the German timeline that the German plan could not absorb without bending. And the German plan bent, and the bend sent Kampfgruppe Piper down a different road burning fuel it could not replace, toward blocking positions that would not have been ready if the crossroads had fallen on schedule. If this investigation into what happened at Losheimergraben meant something to you, if these men deserve to be known by more people than currently know them, hit the like button. It is a small thing, and it matters more than it seems. It keeps stories like this one visible. It tells the people who research and tell these stories that the research and telling is worth continuing. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. The archives are full of men whose names are not famous. They are full of farmhouses and ridge lines and road junctions where the history that appears on the operational maps was shaped by things that do not appear on any map at all. And every December, somewhere in Belgium, the ground above the Losheimergraben crossroads is cold and forested and quiet, and the farmhouse is gone, and the foxholes are grown over, and if you stood there and did not know what happened there, you would not know. You would see forest, you would see a road, you would see an ordinary piece of ground. You would not see the 60 hours or the 100 men, or the decision that each of them made in the particular darkness of their own moment, when the choice was given to them and they chose to stay. Remember them by what they chose. That is the only monument they need.